Stewardship with the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, and I am our Communications and Outreach Chair. RSA is a rancher-founded nonprofit, and we first got our wheels under us 20 years ago in Phillips County, Montana. I love that I'm having to say Montana here tonight because we have folks registered all the way down to Texas. There's a lot of interest in this event, but our home base is in Phillips County, Montana. The community of Malta is where our office is. And we have several different committees that are under our Ranchers Stewardship Alliance umbrella, but the Beginning Rancher Committee and the Education Committee are where this presentation falls under tonight. Now, I like to say about our group that we are a very progressive group with big goals. And one of the biggest ones of all is making sure that we give ranchers all the tools that they need to stay in production agriculture, right? We want to keep ranching and good grassland management on the landscape. And we know that the ranchers are the ones that are doing that right now. And we want to continue to give them the availability to do so. So we primarily do run off of grant money. We get that question a lot. If you have an interest in what we're doing, you can go to our website, that is ranchstewards.org, which Angel is dropped into our chat there, so you can look that up. Two other ways that we're able to bring you this event for free this evening: one, personal and or business memberships. You can be a member of the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance if you feel inspired. That information is up on our website. And then also business sponsorships. So this is the first year we've offered that opportunity, and we want to thank Independence Bank, VSEF Cattle Company, AgriBest Feeds, Montana Livestock Ag Credit, Essie's Wholesale, Bank of Malta, First State Bank of Malta, and Hub International for jumping on with that. So as we do continue on, I can hear somebody's got their microphone on, so it's just going to be your reminder tonight, if you can make sure to mute your microphone. That way we won't have any background noise once Lacy starts speaking. And then because the room is going to be quite large, we actually are going to ask you to turn off your camera as well. That's something that's really actually nice to do in these webinars, when you can turn your camera off to do everything else without fear of everybody watching you. But if you turn off your camera as well, we think that'll help out so that the video isn't too slow. So as I said, we have had a lot of registrations for this event, and a little background of how this happened is we had Dallas Mount. So with Ranching for Profit, he was with us last fall. And coming out of that, we sort of had a bit of an epiphany that maybe we were speaking a bit too high, and we needed to bring the conversation a little bit lower as far as just kind of that initial bookkeeping comfortability, and get ready in that, get comfortable in that before we take it to the next step. So that's where this project was born. As you've seen in our marketing as well as in your workbook, there are 3 distinct sessions for this webinar series. Ground zero is where we're at tonight. That's where do I start? We'll talk accountants and attorneys next week, learning a whole new language. And then the big picture, actionable finances and ranch profitability in week 3. So we're just staggering these out one Monday after another, and we'll have you out of this by June. So speaking of those workbooks, we did have some folks that just signed on here in the last couple of hours. So you did not get one in your email, but Angel is dropping a link into the chat. It's going to be a very lengthy one, but that chat link will bring you to the virtual workbook so that you can kind of see what we're working off of and talking about there. And this same workbook is going to bring you through the 3 different webinars that we have. So if you want to print that off after tonight, you can do that there as well. But mainly it's just a place to sort of keep your notes. If you have any questions that pop up, that's something that you can jot down there tonight. So, all right. Well, hopefully in that workbook, you've had a chance to look at the first 5 pages if you did get it in advance. And a lot of that is talking about your goals. So we sort of addressed that in that initial question of what stresses you out, what's keeping you from keeping good records. And I think that quote on page 6 really brings it all together. And that is that a good system shortens the road to the goal. We all know if we can just get our systems in place, the rest of it's probably going to be a whole lot easier. But for a lot of us, just getting that system in place, it's hard to do. You have to set the time aside to do so, and it's pretty intimidating. So I've been doing our ranch books for a decade now. I still haven't figured out quite what that system is. I wait too long to pay our bills. I'm always waiting way too long to get them entered into any sort of tracking software. And then I'm always stressed out when it comes to taxes and appointments with the bank for our operating loan. And it doesn't have to be that way. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll kind of get to that point where it doesn't have to be that way. If you aren't able to attend all of these sessions, we are going to be recording them, putting them on our Ranchers Stewardship Alliance YouTube channel. Angel is dropping that link there as well. So that was a lot of me talking. We're going to turn it over now to our main speaker. Again, just a reminder, if you can, please turn your microphone off, turn your camera off. If you do have a question, Lacy is welcoming those just during, in progress tonight during her presentation. So go ahead, and if you have a question, type it into the chat, and then we'll make sure that Lacy notices that and can answer that in real time. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So Lacy is the Farm Loan Officer for Glacier, Toole, Liberty, and the north half of Pend Oreille County for the Farm Service Agency in Montana. After 17 years with the FSA, she has a passion for helping people learn to keep good records and understand their financials as the basis for their operation. In her spare time, Lacy keeps up with her 3 kids, 13, 12, and 6, along with the registered Black Angus operation that she and her husband run north of Cutbank, Montana. So Lacy, will go ahead and we'll turn the spotlight over to you this evening.
All right. Well, that is quite the introduction and pressure on everything that we got to get covered tonight. So I just threw this up here to begin with, and you guys answered some of these questions in the chat. And it kind of boiled down to, I think everybody just gets this anxiety fear about record keeping. Where do I start? I'm going to screw this up. And then we hand it all to our accountant, and I ran across this definition of accountant. I thought, oh boy, somebody else is on the same page as I am. A person who does precision guesswork based on unreliable data provided by those with questionable knowledge. Like, I guess my goal is that I'm not in that category of the person turning in these records to the accountant, that they're questioning what it is that I actually gave them. So trying to figure out a way to make that simpler, not only for your accountant, but everybody else that relies on your records, whether that be your banker or your lawyer, your whole family, your operation. It all really comes down to how good are those basic records to be able to move your operation forward. So we're going to cover 3 main things here today, and these are kind of the basis of everything that you're going to have financially relates back to most lenders, FSA, and maybe even some of, like, if you were to get insurance and you need a financial statement for a bond, they're going to want that. So a financial statement, also known as a balance sheet, we're going to cover what goes into that, developing a cash flow projection, and then we'll touch briefly on an income statement, but we're not going to get too far into the weeds on that. And then we're going to spend kind of the rest of the hour focusing on putting together that record keeping system, which seems like what everybody's struggling with, to be able to get good information here on the top side. We probably won't make it through all of my slides, but if you guys have questions throughout it, I want to make sure that we don't leave questions unanswered so you don't get to the end and wonder what it is. So if you type those in and then put your little hand icon up, I will see that, but I can't see your comments, but I'll know to stop, and Haley will let me know what the questions are. So we're going to go ahead and dive in and start with, what is a financial statement? I think the part that really gets people screwed up on putting together a balance sheet is they want to turn this into a projection. And a balance sheet is simply a snapshot in time of where you're at as of that day. Most businesses try and do that at the first of their fiscal year, which for a lot of businesses is January 1st. If you are applying for a loan, most of the time they will want an updated balance sheet that's probably less than 90 days old, or maybe even shorter time period than that if you've had a lot of things that have changed in your business recently and they want to be able to account for that. So taking a look at it, you don't have to get super fancy on this. At the end of the day, if you can at least get down on a piece of paper, what do I own, which are your assets, and what do I owe, which are your liabilities. Then as you get more confident about it, we split those into 3 categories. So you have your current assets, your intermediate assets, and long-term assets, and then the same on the liabilities side. And the reason why this gets important is, in particular, banks look very hard at what they call your current ratio. So I was looking at what you have for current assets compared to what you have for current liabilities. So these current items are reflective of what's going to happen within the next year. So taking a look at, do you have anybody that owes you any money? What do you have for crop inventory on hand? What do you have for livestock to sell? And this can look very different throughout the course of the year. So on January 1, you probably have most of your calves marketed, so you probably don't have much for market livestock. But if you have some farming operation, maybe you still have most of your grain inventory on hand. But if you were to do it again as of May 1st, and all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of baby calves on the balance sheet, they get added on there, but it's at the value at that time of the balance sheet. So baby calves in May, what were they worth? Probably $500 this year, depending if you needed one or not. And then you want to make sure that this stays on track of what that market value is as of the date of the balance sheet. You're not projecting what you're going to have for value of calves at the end of the year. It's as of the date of the balance sheet. And I think that's the number one thing that I see producers do incorrectly on here. And then just being realistic on your crop inventory. If you were to sell it that day, what's it worth as of that day? If you have a contract on it, go ahead and list it on there. But keep in mind, if you have maybe some basis that you haven't accounted for, what are you realistically going to be able to liquidate it for? And then on the flip side of that is your current liabilities, which are the things that you owe within this year. So if you have some accounts payable, like at your local feed store or local fertilizer out there, maybe some real estate taxes that are due, along with the current portion of your debts that are going to be due within the year. And if you have a line of credit out there, those get accounted for, along with any accrued interest that you have as of the date of that balance sheet. And most of the time, the banks aren't expecting you to be able to split these items out real detailed on the liability side. They're going to want to know overall what do you owe, and then they'll get more technical for you. But so you understand kind of what it is that they're looking at and how these items get split out. And then we move down into the intermediate assets and liabilities category. So this is going to be your hard assets, machinery, equipment, vehicles, your livestock, cows, horses, etc., and then the debt that you owe against them. And then the long-term assets, the only thing you're really going to see in here is going to be your land and occasionally those big items like houses, barns, etc., that have a longer depreciation schedule on them that are going to be going on here, and the debt against them. So then at the end of the day, when you go and complete this balance sheet, hopefully you have more assets than you do liabilities. If you have more liabilities than you have assets, that's a very dangerous position and it's called insolvents. You might have heard that term before. And so then this equity measures what your total equity position is. So that gives you a snapshot in time of where it is you are. So let's see, we have a question here.
Somebody wants to know, what about land leases?
So land leases, you can give yourself credit on that for if you have them prepaid. So I know like in this area, we have a lot of farm pasture leases that are due in November, but you don't actually get to use them until June 1 of the next year. So you can give yourself credit under the current assets for prepaid expenses there. And then if there are leases that you owe, you would put those under the current liabilities as accounts payable. And it's kind of up to your discretion a little bit on that of exactly how technical you want to be. Usually I like to see the ones that, are more like they're delinquent as opposed to they're due fully within that 1 year, but it's something to account for and make a note of. And then whoever it is you're working with can decide, where they want it, how they want to account for that exactly. But it's something that if you don't account for it, you can really skew your position from year to year. If 1 year you've prepaid all of your leases and you're sitting in a really good position, and the next year you owe all of your leases as of the first of the year. So the main key thing on all this is figuring out how you're going to report it and then can keep it consistent from year to year. And I suggest that you keep a copy of your balance sheet from the year before. And when you go to build your balance sheet for the next year, pull out that one from the year before. And that gives you a really good starting point and helps you trigger your memory of, oh, I had this on here last year. I should probably do something about it on this year's balance sheet as well. Was there another question too? I see 3 in the chat, but it was popping up.
Not that I can see on my end, Lacy.
Okay, sounds good. It just says the number 3, so I'll try to keep my eye on that. Okay, sounds good. We'll keep throwing in the questions as you have them. So, And so then basically, as I said, this will determine your equity position, which most lenders are going to track from one year to the next. So if you end up with a year that you move backwards quite significantly in your equity position, that can be a major danger sign and something you need to be keeping your eye on. So when you put together that balance sheet, these are the key things that you really want to be looking at. Use realistic valuations. In particular, you oftentimes will get horses that come in at a $40,000 value, or, some precious vehicle from years past that's valued super high. But just be realistic about this. If you actually had to sell this item in a hurry, how much would you be able to get for it? Don't undervalue them, but be realistic. And then make sure, as we talked about, snapshot in time, not a projection. And then make sure you're showing all your assets and liabilities, not just the assets you're planning to pledge as security for a loan. And this is something that I think people often get mistaken about. But when you're providing a balance sheet, you're saying, in the little fine print, you'll see down at the bottom, will say something along the lines of, under perjury of law, I certify that this is a true and correct listing of all my assets and liabilities. So it's a pretty important little statement that you're signing at the bottom of it. Then to kind of put this in perspective, I did this little chart for people that like those kind of things. As you're moving up to the top of your balance sheet, your liquidity improves. So the liquidity meaning that these are the things that are easier to liquidate. So if you have land, if you want to get full value for your land, you're probably not going to be able to get it sold in a day. It's something that's probably going to take you 3 to 6 months to be able to get marketed. You get up into your intermediate assets, so your machinery, equipment, livestock, you're probably not going to get them sold for exactly how much you want on day one, but if you had a couple of months, you probably can get those liquidated fairly easily. The current assets, those are things that in theory, you could dump them today and be able to get those turned into cash in theory. So just to get the little bit of perspective as you move up those lines, how that works. And then as we talked about, if you keep that balance sheet from the year before and you start with that kind of sitting on your table, and then think about it over the course of the year, your cash position will change. So you're paying bills, you're taking money in, your inventories will change. You have cows that you come into your herd, cows that leave, equipment that you buy, etc. You're going to pay down debt. You're probably going to take on some new debt potentially. And all of that stuff should filter through your income and expense records for the 2022 year. And then in some shape or another, is going to hit your financial statement at the end of the year. So you might hear the term bookends. So we're saying that there's a balance sheet at the beginning of the year that starts your bookend and one at the end. And then you stick your income and expenses for the year in the middle, and you should be able to have a really complete picture of what happened within that year. So now we're going to do a little quiz, since I know you guys are so excited about learning lots here, and then we're going to discuss a few things. So if you each can take a couple of minutes here, and I'm going to leave this up on the screen here, and think about what these might be. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see your responses once we talk about it. But think about, are these items an asset or a liability? And would they be considered current, intermediate, or long-term? And then once everybody's had a chance to kind of think about those, we'll have you start throwing those into the chat and discussing it. And if you see something that you don't understand why it was there, definitely throw in the question.
I'm going to go ahead and throw them into the chat too here so people can see the different
Cool. And then I
ones
jumped
that we
off of
looked at.
it.
Nope, we're
Sorry.
good. I took a picture of it. So
Okay.
now it's just seeing how fast of a typer I am. Bill at BTI. What is BTI?
Oh, I should have made that a little more generic. So like your local co-op store.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right. So yeah, lame cow out back, annual operating loan, buildings, the bill at your local feed store, light calves to be sold as yearlings, real estate taxes, and income taxes payable. And so what you're looking for, Lacy, is where they would put these in their financial statement, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And you all can weigh in on that on the chat. Lacy will be able to see it. Lacy, just one point of, again, me being the very basic person on the call and not being so familiar with these things. When you say financial statement, is that the same as balance sheet? Are those completely interchangeable?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
So Tabitha says buildings are an asset long-term, yearlings are an asset. The bill would be a liability short-term and the tax is a liability.
Okay. So let's run through here and let's talk about each of these. So, we have the lame cow out back. And so I think we had a couple of people, looks like here, said that that would be considered a current liability, which it could be. I guess if you are looking at how bad a shape is she something that's going to cost you money to put her down, or do you still have the opportunity that she's something you're going to be able to do something with? Hopefully, as Leaches mentioned there, that she be considered a current asset because we have the option to be able to sell her soon or be able to still turn her into money. If she's one that you need to shoot today, go ahead and do it and then take it off the balance sheet. But that's something you need to balance out. Does she still have any value left to you? Annual operating loan. I don't think I've seen the right answer come through for that one yet. So an operating loan, so that's going to be money that you owe. Oh, Leaches are on a roll here. And Casey, current liabilities, perfect, good job. So that's something that you owe and it's going to be due within less than a year. So it's considered a current liability. Buildings, those are going to be a long-term asset generally, unless there's something that's pretty depreciated out or dilapidated. Bill at BTI or your local feed store, that's going to be something that's considered a current liability. Again, it's something that is going to be due within less than a year. Then we have light calves to be sold as yearlings. Let's see here. I think I saw somebody had in their current asset, which would be correct. So the thing to keep in mind when you do list those on there is make sure you're listing them. You know, if those are 800-pound yearlings right now, your value them at 800 pounds times the 235 that they're worth today, apparently. And giving that value as of today, not when they're going to be finished at 1,200 pounds. But you're planning on selling them within the year. Real estate taxes that are due, that's going to be something that's a current liability because that would be due within the year. Income taxes payable following in that same section as well. So it's going to be due within the year. So getting a little bit of a feel for it there. And I think these slides are going to be available for you guys too. So there's a few more slides in there that you guys can go through and challenge yourself to see if you can figure out what they are. If you already have a balance sheet on hand, take a challenge and see if you have your items in the right area or if you have questions of why they ended up where they were. They'll give you something to talk about. And I had a couple examples on here too. You know, sometimes there's items that there just flat out isn't any value left in them. You know, if you've got some wheat in the bin that sprouted and you really just need to toss it out, then that's something that maybe we can just go ahead and take off the balance sheet at that point. Haley, did you have a question there?
Yeah, we had Jamie wants to ask if you could re-explain the light calves concept again.
Okay, so if those are light calves that you're planning on selling within the year, so say those were calves that, you know, were the dinks off of your 2022 calf crop and you decided to run them over as yearlings and you're going to sell them this fall, those are something that you're going to sell within the year. They're not production livestock, so they're not like your replacement heifers that you're going to keep and be part of your breeding stock. Those are considered a current asset. If it's your replacement heifers, if it is your bred cows, all of those are going to be in your intermediate asset category because those are your production livestock that you have a solid dollar amount that you're valuing and basing your projections on and raising calves off of each year. Does that make more sense?
I'll let you know if he has a follow-up question.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So another thing that's a good idea if you have the opportunity to be able to do it is build yourself a little spread of what your financial statements are and so that you have an idea of where you're at. Here was one that I put in as a sample of taking a look at, and this puts it in a little bit different order than we looked at on there, but still it has this current assets, the intermediate assets, and long-term assets. So you can track that from one year to the next. So like in this situation, they went from having a really good amount of current assets on hand to only just $5,000 of current assets, which could be a major danger signal if they had to liquidate a whole bunch of items out of their current asset section to be able to meet their bills from the last year, and that's putting them in a pinch. And then we look at their intermediate assets. Something that I look at pretty strongly is if it is a ranch or a sheep operation that's raising livestock. If their raised breeding stock numbers start falling, that is concerning because that's what we're using to be able to project our income based off of. And if our cattle numbers are continuing to decrease, it's pretty hard to be able to continue to meet our projections as planned and cover the debt service that we have that's associated with it. And then you can also look at it on the bottom side of it as well. And you're looking at what has happened on the current liabilities. So in this case, they did decrease their current liabilities quite a bit, but maybe there's some other things that went on there. So it gives you an opportunity to check, okay, my equity position over this last year dropped substantially. Is that something that is going to happen again this next year? Or what can I do to be able to prevent further deterioration of my balance sheet? So just want to give you that to give you a little bit of perspective of what are some things that your lender is looking at when you're putting together these balance sheets and why it's so important to make sure you're consistently valuing your items from year to year so you don't have major swings in your operation when you're evaluating those balance sheets side by side. Any questions on the balance sheets before we move into cash flow projection? Okay. So we're talking a little bit about cash flow projection, and everybody always jokes, so is it time to pull out your crystal ball and how good of a projector are you actually? And that is really what a lot of times it feels like it boils down to. But we need to decide, are we basing this on reality? So are we looking at things that have happened in the past? Or are we looking at this through a dreamer's landscape? And so probably we need to be somewhere between those two most of the time. To hit the target there. So we put those items together with a projection, but we have to also look at what changes we have coming. You know, are you looking at that you want to downsize the cows based on the drought situation? And how are we going to be able to show a cash flow projection that actually works for this next year? Or if we want to expand our operation and rebuild after we've had to sell down on cow numbers, how's that actually going to look for us? So when we start looking at that, I like to start on the budget side, so that kind of gives you a baseline of how much money that you actually have to spend. So taking a look at first, how many cows, heifers do I have, bulls? What are they going to produce? So what are they going to have for offspring numbers? What am I going to sell them for? A lot of times your lenders will have a set price list that they are using for everybody. And so if you can get that price list, you have an idea of what you can build your projections around. And if you get to looking at it and you're like, boy, that number just isn't going to work for me, then is there some opportunities that you can get some contracts and be able to go to the bank with a little higher number to be able to base it on. Or maybe you have a solid history of being able to sell for over market to be able to provide that history to your lender to support the production that you're planning for. Haley?
Question is, how do you figure hay shares when you seed, swath, and bale with no contract?
Carefully. That um yeah, that's a loaded question. And it really depends on who your lender is and what their comfort level is. You know, if it's something that you've been doing it for the last 30 years and you have a solid history with that person and everybody's good with a handshake arrangement, you probably can keep going on with that. If you're going into your bank and you're telling them, I'm going to sell 1,000 ton of hay this year, which I have never done before, and I'm going to do it on this new lease that I picked up, that's going to be problematic. So yeah, be realistic in what it is you're doing and be prepared to have some way to be able to defend what it is that you're projecting. So sorry for the background noise there. We had a visitor. Be as able to support your values as possible, I guess, is what it boils down to. And when you do that, figure out what your shares are. And if you have the ability to be able to get some solid history to work off of what they've had for yield history in the past to give you a good baseline, that goes a long ways as well. Okay. Have a contract. A lot of times your lenders or whoever it is you're with will want to know that. Sorry, I'm getting a bunch of error messages. There we go. Do you have any crops that you will sell or keep? So keeping that in mind as well, you know, if you're planning on expanding your herd size considerably, what are you going to do for that hay that you're bringing in? Are you adding some extra hay land, or you have the opportunity to buy the hay that you need? If you have traditionally crops and now you're going to start feeding it, that to consideration when you're doing the budget as well. And so then starting with your basic baseline there, if you have cows, figuring out how many cows you actually have that are bred. What are you looking at for a calf crop percentage? The state average has been right around like 87 or 88%, but I see that vary widely from area to area and based on management. Your cows and you have pretty decent puppies, you probably can be higher than that. If you haven't preg tested, feeding program isn't quite what you want it to be, then you're probably going to be lower than that. And if you can keep a good solid history on that, that's important to be able to justify your production that you're projecting. And the same thing on weaning weights. Do you have a solid history that you can show? My 3-year average is usually what we base it off of at that weaning weight history has been, and then figuring out, I'm liking this that I keep hearing, but is that really what I want to base my whole projection off of, that I'm actually going to get 3 pounds and spend accordingly? So maybe backing that off to, you know, $1.80 or $2 a pound based on the market, and then knowing, well, if I can keep my budget in line with that and I've got extra money at the end of the year, I know where I'm going to spend it or be able to save some or pay down some debt, etc. And then using that same sheep and figuring out what your weaning percentage there, or if you have sows that you're looking at marketing, how many piglets do you have per litter that actually end up alive at the end of the year that you're able to sell? And same thing on crops. I have an example here a little bit later of your APH report. That's a really good way to be able to have a good solid projection that you can use for off of that side as well. Keep in mind too, are you keeping replacement? That's something that unless you get set up to keep replacement heifers from the very beginning, it's really hard to get back into the swing of keeping replacement heifers, ewe lambs, sows, etc., to be able to maintain that basic herd number. And so keep that in mind as well. If you're trying to project that you've got enough money to be able to cover it by selling all your calves, what are you going to do to buy back cows to maintain your numbers and be able to make next year work as well? And then do you need replacement cows, bulls, or heifers? Especially with where bull prices are at right now, that can be a major game changer if you have a whole bunch of bulls that end up not testing, which seemed to be the theme this year, at least in this area. So being prepared to be able to add an extra bull into the mix if you do need it. If you're adding some extra land, thinking about what that's going to do to your crop production levels, etc. And number of basic worksheets. This is one that FSA.gov, you'll find this real basic one there. They've updated their forms and they actually have one that will do the math for you now too. And so that's an option. You can break it down into each of those items. Haley, a question?
Yeah, somebody wants to know how many heifer calves would you say to keep to replace one cow?
That's another thing that's a really important thing to keep a good. You will run into people all across on their opinions on that. Um, Usually kind of the default rule of thumb is that you want to save 15% of your bred cow numbers as replacement heifers. And I would argue that that's probably almost bare minimum, especially if you've just bought a new bunch of cows. You're going to have a bunch of cows fall out depending on where they're at in their age brackets. They change locations. Do you have a bunch of culling? Getting just a real good feel of add on that. If you know what your percentage of opens are each year, then add on another couple percent for death loss, and that gets you your bare minimum of what you probably need to replace. But that isn't allowing you to do anything for culling for the cows that really should be culled. We always get in an argument around here because we're always like, well, she's bred, I guess she gets to stay another year. But then by come springtime, it's like, why in the world did we keep her? And like everybody else, one more bred cow. And so able to get comfortable with that number of what works for your operation. Yeah, I had one guy that I worked with that he said you should always keep 35% replacement heifers so you had enough room to get rid of all of your culls that you needed to. So it's something that I think you really got to work through and decide, but that 15 to 20% range is a pretty good place to start. The other thing that you get into those arguments on is how much cost you have into is it cheaper just to go ahead and buy a cow? And so that's something that you need to definitely decide for yourself. You have both camps of that decision of the cows that I raise myself always do better, but then you have the other side of you're probably $1,700 to $2,000 into developing a bred heifer. Is that, when you consider the cost of her in the fall, is that a cost that you can afford to? Was there
And
another question there?
there is, yeah. What site do you get the worksheet from?
Say, what was that?
What site do you get that worksheet from? They want to know.
If you go to farmers.gov, and there should be a link in there to the FSA loan part of it. And this is one of the forms that's on there. It should be the FSA-2038. If you Google that, it should even pop up under there. But the new form that's uploaded on the farmers.gov worksheet, or website, I should say, has it where it will do the math for you. And most of your lenders that you're working with, a lot of them have some Excel sheet that looks pretty similar to this, that if you ask them if they can give it to you, then you can load all your numbers in. When you're done, email it to them. And a lot of times then they're pretty much able just to use that to go on, and they don't have to do a bunch of additional data loading. So they like that too. So that might be an option for your lender as well. Is there another one?
I don't believe so.
Okay, sounds good. So when you're looking at this, I think we had somebody ask about the percentage of share on there. So that's like on your hay ground here. If you put in 100 acres of hay ground, you figure out what you think you're going to have for yield, then put your percentage of share that you're going to get, how many total ton you'll have, how much you're going to save for yourself, if you're going to buy some to be able to use, and then what you're going to have for sales. Same thing down here on the livestock side. Raising, purchasing, what you'll have for sales. And this can be a really important number. Another thing, if you are in a higher death loss area, it's a good idea to be keeping track of what your death loss rates are, and can help you do a better job of projecting where you're at on that annually. The other thing that I really like to do is to be able to get all of this in a comparison. Kind of a numbers geek on this type of stuff, but I like to be able to put my past history in a real easy to see format. So getting 3 years worth of information up on the screen. So this would be 3 years worth of actuals that was loaded in this sample here. And then doing a 3-year average, and then laying out my projection for the next year in this column. And then this is set up that it tells you how much you're off compared to your projection. So it gives you a really good ability to look down this line and see, does this make sense compared to what I've been doing in past history? If I'm projecting 100,000 in crop sales for this next year, is that really legit when the most I've ever had in the last 3 years is $12,000? Well, maybe if I picked up a bunch of extra acreage, or maybe that was because I've had a whole bunch of crop insurance that has been where all my income came from on the crop side, and I'm projecting that I'm actually going to be able to have a crop to cut this year, then maybe that makes sense. Same thing looking at the livestock and poultry sales. It looked like this one had been on an upward swing, but maybe they cut back on numbers. So being able to get a little bit of an idea of, is this in the range of past history of what I'm projecting, and can I defend what it is that I'm projecting? For me, the really key part of it, though, is on the operating expenses. A lot of these items are what we would call fixed expenses, which they're not going to change much from year to year in terms of if you have 100 cows or you have 200 cows. So if you take a look at, say, your real estate taxes, if you're not adding any additional land that you own that you have to pay real estate taxes on, that's a fixed expense that isn't going to change based on the number of cows that are out there. But some of these items are more considered variable expenses. So things like your chemical and feed and fertilizer, that as you increase your cow numbers and your acreage that you're cropping, they're going to go up in relationship to that. So it gives you a bit of a base.
There's some of these
If you keep track of how many acres you were maybe cropping or how many cows that you had in each of these years, it gives you a really good idea of, well, I was at 100 cows in this year. This year I've doubled them. How does that compare? And just being able to kind of double check yourself of, did I really think of anything, or am I cutting myself short here based on what I've done in the past? And then being able to defend that position.
line item down here is probably one of the major ones that gets
That's owner with or family living expenses. So you can see here they're projecting 20,000, and you look at past history, they were steadily increasing from 60 to 63 to 65,000. So can we realistically be able to cut that all the way down to 20,000 within 1 year? And if so, how are we going to do that? I get a lot of questions. People say,
or what's kind of an average.
that's something that is hard to give you a real good baseline because everybody has a little different situation. Are you living on a ranch that has a house provided and taxes are paid through the ranch, and a lot of those items are ending up here in your operating expenses? Or are you separating those out and you're paying for your utilities and those items separately? And that can make this number quite a bit bigger. Who's paying for the personal vehicle?
Living side, or is that coming out of the operating expenses?
Be very realistic with yourself of, is this personal or is this a ranch expense, and getting that dialed in. There's several different lenders that have done quite a few studies across their customer base, and a lot of them pretty much have a thumbnail picture of $12,000 to $15,000 per family member in the household. And so that can give you a bit of a baseline, but that is going to vary widely.
I had seen a really interesting
study from, I think it was Minnesota State, and they had gone through and figured out what the true cost of family living expenses were by the time you figured out the car that they were driving personally, the fuel, the insurance, all of those things, the value of their housing, etc. To have the same standard of living that they were having on the farm or ranch would equate to that they would have to have a job that was $88,000 per year. And I know a lot of us are probably thinking, well, I
$8,000 a year lifestyle.
looking at some of those things, it's like, okay, well, that adds up. So getting that history can make a big difference and be able to support what it is that you're doing. Then there's just a few things that you can take a look at as you're wanting to put together that cash flow budget. Check your balance sheet and think about, do I have some carryover livestock or inventory that I need to sell? What do I have for maybe
that I need to make sure that I'm budgeting for?
Are you doing any equip or FSA programs potentially that you have to spend some extra money in order to receive the egg program or payment that goes with it? Are you looking at opportunities to add an extra 50 head of cows, or do you want to pick up a lease? Are you trying to figure out, is it worth it to buy your own baler or hire the baling done? Those are all things that you can take a look at as part of that cash flow budget. And maybe you want to pull these out and just do
What will the 50 head of cows bring you in for income? And what are
variable expenses to know if those 50 head by themselves are actually going to generate enough income to cover the payment associated with them? Or do you have to have your 100 cows you already have pay for these 50 cows? Is your non-farm income likely to change? Or are you looking at that you would like to quit your non-farm job? Are you going to be able to afford to do that? Well, your living expenses change. We talked quite a bit about that. With FSA, we have a lot of beginning farmers that come in, and they are usually unmarried and just getting started. But by the time that they're done with our program, usually they're well on to having a family. And so that's something that we need to budget for and be able to plan for. We talked about the replacement rates. Do you have old cows that you need to turn over? That's something that is very important to consider. Do you have some hay fields maybe you want to reseed? This one, what are interest rates doing this year? That has been a pretty big budget item for a lot of people when interest rates have almost doubled here over the last year, if not more. That is going to be a big line item expense. And then taking a look at, do I have some options that I can be able to do some forward marketing on, both maybe selling my crops, or livestock? And do I have any access to dependable feed? And do I have the ability to buy my hay this summer and get it hauled in before the snow flies, etc.? So then a couple of other things that I'm just going to throw this out here, and might be more than you want to know, but one thing I really like to look at is, what is my operating expense ratio? And so to figure this out, this is taking what your total expenses are and taking off any interest and depreciation that you have and dividing it by your total income for your farm or ranch operation. Ideally, you're looking at that should be 65% or less. And so what that's telling you is it costs you 65 cents to earn $1. So oftentimes, though, what we see is a lot of beginning farmers and ranchers, we are getting stuck with the expensive leases and doing things that are probably slightly crazy. And so we're getting that operating expense ratio that's up into that 70 to 80%. Maybe even you have years where hay prices are through the roof, like this last year, that you actually had over 100%, where you actually were paying for the pleasure of feeding your cows. And so that's something that gives you a little bit of an idea.
projection? Is this realistic?
If you've been running in that 70% operating expense ratio and you put your projection together and all of a sudden you're down to 30%, you probably better go back and look at it and take a look at, is this actually realistic, what I'm doing to change these items here? Another one that can really get you is interest expenses we talked about. And one item you can look at there is, how much are you paying in interest?
Target ratio they like to see is less than 10% on that.
Not saying that's live or die, but when you start having more than 10% of your income going to interest, that's a really big line item dollar, especially if you're planning on drawing anything off of your farm or ranch to be able to live on, and you've got any term debt that you're trying to service with payments on there as well. So just a couple of things to keep in mind there. Any questions on the cash flow projection before we dive into the next?
Lacy, I have not seen any new questions.
Okay. So then the other thing, and I just wanted to throw this out here because you might hear this word, and if you're like me, the word income statement, I'm like, ugh. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around, and it gets thrown out there a lot of times by accountants and trying to figure out what that really means. And the most simple format is, it's going to take your cash flow statement or your cash flow projection that we just talked about, where we're talking,
and it adjusts to what your actual
income and expenses were for that calendar year. So it's taking all of those carryover livestock that you had in there, or carryover bills, and it's kicking those back to the year before.
Credit for the things that you maybe are
sell in the next year. So trying to get everything into, if you sold and paid all your expenses, say for instance in 2022, what would 2022 look at by itself? And so this is what really explains profitability. The cash flow projection can be something that you can come up with a really big number at the end of the year, but that could be because you were selling a bunch of carryover items from the year before.
What it is that you have going on.
Something that you probably do in your head all the time. I remember a lot of times growing up, the conversation would be is that, you know, mom was upset at the end of the year because there wasn't any money left in the checkbook, and my dad, the eternal optimist over there, was like, but we kept 50 replacement heifers this year and we've never been able to keep that many replacement heifers, and next year's going to be better. And then there'd be the years that, oh, there's some money left in the checkbook, and be like
All the replacement heifers, and we haven't been
buy back any replacements. And so it's trying to basically get from not looking at what's in your checkbook, but looking at what actually happened in the year by itself to try and figure out what actually went on. Did you actually make a profit in calendar year 2022? Or are you actually going to make a true profit off of 2023 production? So don't get too wrapped up in fully getting that understood, but I just want to throw that out.
That's what we're talking about.
So we've been through all of that, and now I want to dive into putting together your actual records, which is the base and the heart of everything that we do to be able to build that cash flow projection and build your balance sheet. And as much as in that first slide I showed there, the definition of accountant, you're the only one that knows this. The accountant can't guess it. The lender can't guess it. You're the one that's going to have to keep track of it.
Somebody to do your accounting, but they're only as good as the
information that you give them. And we look at this from two different sides, both your production records and then also your income and expense records as well. And in theory, those should match up. So what you have for production that you say that you sold, all of those items should be tracking through your income and expenses. So on the production record side of things, I'm guessing most of the folks on here today are ranchers.
red book that you can fit in your pocket.
Keep track of your calving records. In there, it's up to you what things you want to keep track of. There's a lot of really cool little charts that are in there. But ideally, at a minimum, being able to keep track of the date of birth, the cow number that had at that calf, storm events. You know, for larger operations, this might not be a realistic way of tracking it. But if you end up with a large storm event and you're trying to apply for
programs like the livestock indemnity program, you have to be able to prove how much
you had on the ground as of the date of the storm and what kind of the weather was. And this is a great record to be able to fall back on. There's also a section in there for vaccination records, which that can be really important in these days where we're providing all sorts of additional information to our buyers about when those calves were vaccinated and what all they were given. There's a section for doing weaning records. There's also some crop production
in there as well, and it's a nice little calendar too.
Extension offices across the state, I believe, have them. Usually they're either free or like $4, well worth the investment. Keeping track of these can also help for other purposes as well. When we talk about those ones that we want to be able to cull, it always seems like everybody is in agreement during calving time about the one that's put somebody over the fence that we are going to sell her. But when it actually gets around to time to market them in the fall,
about that cow. So being able to look back at those records,
maybe there's a replacement heifer that you really like, but you go back and look at their past records and see that her mom has never successfully raised a calf more than once. And maybe that's not where we want to go with it. And then as I talked about, a lot of the FSA disaster programs relate back to your own production records. So it's really important to keep track of that. Insurance claims are very important on that as well.
Where you can show your movement between pastures, which could be important.
Something that happened in one particular pasture, how many cows you had in there. Property taxes, income taxes, if you're trying to reconcile your cow numbers for the bank, FSA is pretty big on that. Being able to show where all the cows ended up is important. And then this, I just did a little scan of a sample calving book here of what are some things that you might want to keep track of. For
especially if you end up with some
the storm, what it was that they died from, etc. The weather event section, again, that's great for livestock programs. If you're keeping track of how much hay you fed, when you moved cows around, etc., that can be really key for a lot of these programs. I mentioned earlier too, taking a look at your APH report. This is can be requested from your crop insurance agent if you have insurable crops, and they can give
up to 10 years worth of past information on here.
history. So that's really valuable piece of information to have. For those non-insurable crops, so like probably a lot of your hay crops or new crops that crop insurance doesn't cover, need to keep track of that somewhere, of how many acres were actually sold and what you had for yield, etc. I see that this time is just getting away from us really
Breeze through a couple of items here and then
to get off. I totally understand, or I can keep going too, whichever works for everybody. But when we get into actual financial history, we want to make sure that we're tracking all income and all expenses, and that ideally we're getting that itemized. We're splitting that between both personal income and expenses and keeping those as separate categories from the stuff that is for our business. If you have other non-farm businesses, you want to be able to keep that separate, because that's going to be something that your accountant probably.
As far as what
Probably in a simple answer, everything, at least you have it then. But as you get more comfortable with your system, you can probably get it fine-tuned a little bit more. At a minimum, the things that you are deducting on your tax return, you're going to want to keep all of those receipts, and then figuring out some way to be able to store it well, so you can actually get back to it if you need to, and talk with your accountant on how long you need to keep that. Generally,
cases you might need up to 7 years.
they also have the option in a lot of these computer programs that you can take a picture of the receipt with your phone and be able to upload it to your actual Quicken account or whatever it is you have. And so then you're not getting stuck with all this paper. So that is an option as well. It's important to keep track of your debt payments, both of how much is paid to principal and interest. One thing that I see a lot of times producers miss
Is made payable to them and their lender.
Go in and they just sign the check over to the lender, and then they forget to include it in their books. And then when they get to the end of the year, they get a lot of confusion there. So make sure that when you have those, that you keep track of them in your records and being able to get that split out. Haley?
We have somebody that wants to know if you have a computer software program that you would suggest.
I'm not technically supposed to.
That my default answer on that.
I personally use Quicken, and I haven't found something that I like better than that. I have a lot of people that do use QuickBooks. I feel like you probably have to be fairly good at accounting to get what you want out of QuickBooks and feel comfortable with it. But you can do something as simple as putting together an Excel spreadsheet, especially if you have a fairly simplistic operation. The big thing that when you get a lot of these is
they come with a lot of preloaded categories, and
of them aren't real ag specific. So going into the category list and refining that to what it is that you actually want to keep track of, and then visit with your accountant and maybe your banker as well of what are the things that you want to see me track, and being able to get those categories to match up with what they need. And do not go category crazy. You have a lot of options to be able to keep adding categories in there, but sometimes you just get too bogged down.
I really liked in Quicken, and I think maybe a few
programs have that option as well now, but they have a tag as well. So you can do the main category, say like your feed expense. And then if you want to tag that separately to like say your bulls or your heifers or your cows, you can tag that separately.
So your vet expense. And so at the end of
Here, you can look at what you spent as a whole summary across all your feed. And then if you want to get more detailed, you can look at what did it cost me to develop my heifers across the feed expense, across the vet expense, supplement, etc., and be able to try and do some of that enterprise accounting. It's not a perfect system, but it does give you a little bit of an ability without having 10 trillion categories, which makes everybody frustrated at the end of the year. Is the main thing.
with it, you consistently categorize.
And that's where seems like we end up with a lot of problems from year to year, especially if you're looking at that income and expense trend and trying to project and figure out, why did I have a year that was so much higher than the rest? Do you have another question there, Haley?
Yeah, so kind of a couple that are stacked on top of each other, and we have one from Janine. She says, is there a program that's not housed online? I don't want my records online. I can speak to QuickBooks. QuickBooks does have an online or a desktop version. You can speak on Quicken, obviously, but there are softwares that are available that are not just online focused. And then we've got another question that is, where do you put income from FSA programs with your cash flow projection? Do you add it in the plan budget for the year?
Okay, so let's start with the one on not housed on there. So you can get a Quicken program that is not housed on there. You can download it to your personal computer and you can keep it totally separated. To me, the biggest advantage of having Quicken or one of those is the fact that you have the computerized download from your bank account, and you can actually start training it to categorize things automatically for you. So it's kind of a catch-22 of, they have a pretty good security system on there, what kind of risk you're willing to take in exchange for that data load.
Worth it just because of the time,
not having to go through and enter every single thing, as opposed to being able to just cruise through them and make sure that I've got them correct. But again, an Excel spreadsheet for most operations is probably plenty sufficient, at least to get started. And then remind me again, what was the other question, Haley?
The other one is, where do you put income from FSA programs within your cash flow projection?
Okay, so
generally we are not projecting a
payments on there unless there's something that is a repeatable event. So say for instance, you have CRP payments that you're going to get every year for the next 10 years. That's something that you can legitimately add to your cash flow projection. As far as like if you've had the livestock forage program for drought or those disaster related programs, you're not going to want to project those unless you already know that you have a payment coming.
A lot of the
we projected a lot of what was DCP, or now we're to ARC PLC payments. And when prices are low, you can go in and you can have a pretty good idea of if you might have a payment coming in those and being able to project them. But for the most part, most of the lenders really aren't going to add those in unless there's a pretty solid history of receiving them from year to year. Okay.
And
All
Lacy,
right.
I am going to go ahead and just mention real quickly for folks that maybe need to jump off because it is just past 8:30. Lacy's very willing to stay on with us, and so I'm going to let Lacy do so. But if you have to hop off, we absolutely understand. This full presentation will be available, Lacy's PowerPoint, as well as the video on our YouTube channel, so that you can join in and catch the end of it if that was something that you had to do to jump off. So Lacy, take her away. I'll let you just keep on talking and keep on getting these questions answered.
Okay, sounds good. I could talk all night, but I will try and get through this. Probably, I think another half hour to hit the high points here if people are kind of trying to decide if they really need to go do something else. So then hitting into here, the family living and personal debt repayment, keeping that separate is a really good idea. And so we can address that from year to year. And then within that, figuring out, are there specific things with
If you're trying to figure out how you're
family living expenses over the next year, if you don't know what items within family living that they're going, that makes that pretty difficult to be able to do it. And maybe it's something you decide it's not worth it for me to track it for the whole year. Try and do it for even 1 month and kind of see what it is that you're spending on maybe eating out or some of the items that you could reasonably budget for and be able to cut options there. Then
numbers for sales, so that keeping track of
settlement sheets when you sell livestock or when you sell grain, what's out there. Keeping track of those bank statements is really good. A lot of times those are available online, but only for probably 18 months, maybe a little bit longer. Otherwise, they'll have you have to pay for those. So that might be something that is worth it to you to download or print them off. And then keeping those production records with it as well. So then figuring out what is a way that you can keep all.
If you're just beginning operation, probably the simplest thing that
is an envelope method. This is where you get a large manila envelope and you label your envelopes with what are the categories that you want to track. And then as you have those expenses, you put the receipts in the envelope and put how much the receipt was for on the outside. So then at the end of the year, you can go down your tally list and tally it up and close your envelope and you're done. So if you have a pretty simplistic operation,
feed store, and you're doing 4 or 5 different cats,
is something that can work fairly well to get you started. I've had a couple of other people that have done similar thing with a 3-ring binder, and they get a bunch of those sheets that you can put in there that have the top load, and they put the receipts in there, and that works pretty well for them. You can still get the old school ledgers that are really long and be able to do that. The worst part is if you mess up on your math, you've got to fix it several different ways, and that can be frustrating.
Program as well. I put together
some categories on it. If you would like to take a look at that and see if that's something that at least gets you jump started, feel free to drop me an email and I'd be happy to send that to you. And then of course you can upgrade and get into some type of computer program. No matter what it is that you do, the key to all of this is having a filing place, have a method and a plan of attack, and then somebody that's going to be in charge of it. And then figuring out how.
I had listened to a few years ago.
They said that they made it a routine that Sunday morning at 9 a.m. they had an hour date with their books every single week, whether they needed to or not. That was just the time that they had set aside that they were going to work on it and get things updated. So if you can be consistent about that, that goes a long ways. I think I ended up with this slide out of order here, so we'll skip over this. So then this just gives you,
say you spent $17,000 at CHS.
Somehow in your record keeping system, be able to split that out accurately, that you spent 10,000 of that for chemical and 7,000 for fertilizer, because those are different line items on your Schedule F. And then if you went to say Rocky Mountain, what are all the different things that went in there? And you probably grabbed a pizza on your way out the door. So making sure that that all doesn't get lumped together and assumed that it's fuel. So these are a few different.
As I work through these with people,
one is mixing farm expense with personal expense. If you're a big fan of using a credit card or debit card, are you making sure that those are actually getting accounted for in your expenses? How are you handling that? Cash and no record of how it was used. If you're saying it went for labor, if you get audited, can you back that up? Was it an actual business expense or was it for living? Only one person who understands the bookkeeping system. My mom started a 3-ring binder that I think is a really good idea, and we call it her If I Die book. And so in that, she has a copy of all of the important information of who they have loans with, who they have leases with, their contact information, copies of all of the deeds, copies of the leases, all of their account information that somebody would need in order to pick up the operation and be able to continue it tomorrow. Not saying that my dad would be able to log on to the computer system, but
walk through the steps to be able to keep business going and
tomorrow. Not keeping track of receipts to be able to go back and look at what it is that items were actually spent on. No copies of bill of sales to be able to show exactly how many cows that were purchased or bulls, etc. If you're relying that on December 31st, you're going to go back through your carbon copies of your checkbook, are you actually going to be able to read those after they've sat in somebody's hip pocket for the entire year? So staying on top of those.
Or relying on your bank.
A lot of times people are like, well, I'll just get the bank statements at the end of the year. A lot of those, the way that they're deposited now, get very vague. And so it can be very difficult to figure out what they went back to. Make sure if you are using some kind of computerized system that you back it up and back it up frequently. The worst thing that can have happen is that you lose your computer system and you have to start over. Make sure it matches up with what it was that you sold. So
Signed over to the bank if you can't find a record of it.
Included in. Make sure that you get all of your capital expenditures in there. Or if you have capital contributions, so say that somebody in your family gifted you some money or gifted you some equipment, somewhere keeping track of that so that when it comes time to update your tax records, you have that there. Transfers between checking and savings accounts and between family members make everybody's.
That's something that you have to be very careful.
Correctly, if you're reimbursing family members for ranch expenses, make sure that you're actually accounting for that correctly. There's a few different ways that you can do that, but make sure that you're tracking it consistently because that can get very confusing on everybody's end. A couple of tips that I've picked up from producers that I work with, they created an Ask My Accountant category. And so on those ones that you're like, I have no idea what to do with this, just dump that in your Ask My Accountant category. And so then at the end of the year, or when you visit with your accountant quarterly, ask them, these are the things that I'm confused on. Can you help me get these in the right spot so that they aren't lost somewhere in the mix and they never get accounted for? Another one that I like is this small tools category. It seems like there's a lot of those items, especially when you're a beginning producer, that you're buying all these tools and you just start to think, is this ever going to end? But being able to give yourself a little bit of credit for those items that are out there and knowing that that wasn't all repair items, this was buying some tools. Make sure that those savings accounts are tracked correctly. Again, bill pay is one that kind of amazes me, the number of people that I visit with that aren't not using bill pay. I love it, especially at the beginning of the month. I can go in there and I have all of the local feed stores in there preloaded, and so I can get their bills, sit down, put in the dollar amount, hit the pay button. They write the check, they mail it, it goes, and I know it gets done on time. As opposed to, oh shoot, it's the end of the month and I all of a sudden have to find a checkbook, find an envelope, find a stamp, and somehow get it to the mailbox in time. That never seems like it quite works out. So to me, that has been something that has been a major game changer in getting bills paid timely and well. And
The reimbursements tracked well. And then
any actuals does not work. So if you come in to your accountant or to your lender and you have a whole bunch of zeros on the end of your actuals, it's obvious that this was a total estimation. So make sure you have a pretty good idea of where those items are going. And you can start pretty simple. So this is a screenshot of the Excel spreadsheet that I put together. And so you would have who it was that you paid, what the total dollar amount was, and then you can split it out among multiple categories and be able to have a memo to be able to describe what it was that was there when you have to go back later and figure it out. This is kind of a screenshot of a computerized program. This is a Quicken program. Kind of a screenshot of what I have. This shows the automatic download that comes off of my bank account, and it preloads it when you hit the update button. You hit accept all and it bops it all up into your check register here, and then you can go back through and categorize it. So like a check that was a handwritten check, you'll have to go in and actually tell it what the category was, but all the other items, you get it trained and it knows what to do and be able to get it categorized quickly and easily. Then this shows when you want to split out in Quicken, and same with a lot of these computerized programs, allows you to do these individual.
like on it, as I mentioned earlier, as well as
line items out. A couple of cautions about those auto downloads. Some of the banks will charge for download services, some are free, so just take a look at that. You do have to establish your online banking ID and make sure if you are relying on the auto categorize that it actually is getting it categorized correctly. Haley, question?
So you had said not to get category crazy as you're dividing these all up. Is there a place that you would suggest going to develop what your categories are?
Yes. Let me see if I have a screenshot before I get too carried away here. Yeah, we're going to get to that just a second here.
Perfect.
Okay, so this is talking about setup is key.
about what they would like, but
Going to irs.gov, and if you need a little extra help on it, and you can search for all of those forms there and be able to see what exactly that you have on there. This shows the summary page of your 1040, which is the front 2 pages of your tax return generally. And these are kind of like some major master high level categories that are on there. So you can glance through those and figure out what of these things do I actually need to track.
maybe you have some pension and annuities or social security benefits you want to track.
Really for most of our, and maybe you get into some of these itemized deductions as well, if you have medical and dental expenses that you're able to deduct on there, that you want to be able to track that separately. Those items can be important to set up for categories, as well as like gifts to charity, etc. Interest that you paid on your home mortgage, all of those might be important. But for our farmers and ranchers out here, your meat and potatoes is take a look at.
So the top half of your Schedule F is going to the farm.
You're using the cash method. And so then this rolls through and we'll show you what your options are for reporting on there. So at a minimum, I would say these are the categories that you want to be for sure using. And then splitting it out further from there is based on how much additional information you want to know for your purposes. So like they lump together all sales of livestock, produce, and grains. And I was
Put that into, you want sales of livestock, you want sales
of hay or something like that to be able to split that out further. If you're getting into some more enterprise accounting, like maybe you have some specialty flock that you're selling,
really drill down and figure out
making any money on it, that you want to put that separately, or you want to track, say, malt barley as a separate category from year to year, figuring out how detailed you want to go on there. What I would recommend doing though, is if you're doing it as part of a computer program, make a basic category that is this, and then you can do subcategories below it. So you don't have to have a whole bunch of adding that you're doing and it's not in order. That kind of my thing that drives me crazy, but it's up to you how much adding you want to do. And then like cooperative distributions, egg program payments, crop insurance, custom hire, etc. And then taking a look at what is your cash flow projection that your bank is using and trying to get
usually are the same as the Schedule F categories is kind of
in egg lending. And then the same thing on the farm expense side, splitting it out among these categories gives you a really good baseline. And then you just have to figure out what other expenses are worth it to you to be able to track specifically that don't fall into these items. On the irs.gov website, there is a really good farm and ranch taxpayers guide on there, and it does give some additional information.
categories. It's not perfect, but it
Bit of an idea of what works and doesn't, if you just want to be able to get it in a little bit more plain English without having to have your accountant charge you $350 an hour to explain those items to you. But then think about, do you want to keep category here of tax preparation, legal expense, maybe marketing expense, etc. What are those things here that are important to your operation to know how much it is it's costing you? Were there any other questions before I dive into this 1099 piece?
Nope, go for it.
Okay. So the other thing that I think is worth keeping track of as well is making sure that you're able at the end of the year to pull information for those people that you have to send 1099s to. So those people that you have to send 1099s to is anybody that you've paid at least $10 in royalties or broker payments, and that you've paid at least $600 in rent,
agriculture, and then
1099s if you got crop insurance proceeds, etc. And there are some exemptions on this. So if it's somebody like you're paying, say, BIA or a corporation, that you don't have to send them a 1099. But if it's a private individual that you're leasing from, then we have to send them these 1099s. So that is one thing that I really like about the computerized program, that you're able to
your payments there and see who it is that you need to
be able to send those to. You can also add a tag of a 1099, so then you can run a report, and it's easy to be able to look at who those are that you need to send out the 1099s to. And then also thinking about if there's people that you have employed to come do work for you. So say this is the shirt tail mechanic that comes out to your business that isn't part of a dealership that you're paying,
or somebody that's coming out and
work for you that isn't part of a corporation. So that's somebody else to keep in mind as well for that 1099 information. Then just to kind of give you an idea, this is a category list that I pulled out of our Quicken, and you can kind of, and it will track for you how often you're using those categories as well. So you can take a look through here from year to year and say, well, you know, I'm really not tracking too much in that category. Maybe I need to look at that differently.
I'd like to do a big business
category and then split it into those Schedule F items within that. So it's easy to be able to see throughout the course of the year what our business expense and business income is, and have a really good idea where we're sitting for potential tax liability. And then this will just give you an idea of a category versus a tag. So I liked putting together tags for different pieces of equipment, because there's a lot of them that have
this case tractor. If I
year that we spent more in repair bills than a new payment would be, maybe we can justify being able to actually get a new tractor, or newer tractor, I should say, and being able to just see across different categories, as I talked about, like maybe your heifers, seeing how much they actually cost you to develop, or how much you're putting into your cows across different categories. And so then like this
look through when you can drill into these items and you look and say,
oh, repair bills this year were astronomical. What in the world happened? But to be able to look through there and see, okay, well, we had a few of these items that, oh, the turbo went out. That was an expensive item. Hopefully that's not going to happen again this next year. But seeing how much was routine repairs and maintenance versus big ticket items, and that really helps with being able to project going forward. There's some of these items too that might be things
and you actually can put them out on depreciation
because you improve the length of that item of machinery or equipment based on what it was you did to it. Maybe you overhauled an engine on a combine and you don't want to expense out the full 40,000 in 1 year, and being able to depreciate that out. Then there are also some cool little charts that are in there, and it will show you kind of what your big ticket items are with your real visual person to be able to see how those match up. So just some fun things that you can play with when you
programs.
Here are some things that I do when get to the end of the year and trying to figure out if I got everything accounted for. So do the numbers make sense? When you pull your reports at the end of the year, is there something that jumps out of you that, oh, it says 80,000 in that category? That can't possibly be right. Going back in there and looking and seeing if there was some things that maybe got miscategorized, and then comparing it to what it was that you projected for the
Projected 30,000 and he spent 70. Well,
wrong, and is that something that I need to account for and be able to get set up better for this next year? And then look to, if you're using a computerized program, it will show you anything that isn't categorized, and so then it's easy to jump in there and get those items tagged. And then see, does your account balance that it's showing in your computer program actually match up with your bank account? If it's off, are there some checks that are still outstanding there? And are you going to deal with
Year next and being able to keep that consistent from year to year.
So then when you get to the end of the year, trying to figure out, well, how did I do? These are some things that you can take a look at. Did you cover all your bills? Where does your equity position go? I think most of us after the last couple of years and buying hay and everything else, we're just worried about, will my banker lend me money again? But maybe there's some other things that we need to be taking a look at, and can I meet my goals going forward?
Oftentimes
to a bank, they might not ask you for a written business plan, but something you can be thinking about, or if you really want to wow them, is writing down a business plan, putting together what is called a SWOT analysis. So what are some strengths of your operation? What are some weaknesses, opportunities for growth, or what are some threats to your operation that you know that you need to be able to manage going forward? And then what are some goals that you want to accomplish within the next?
One of my favorite borrowers,
Not that I'm allowed to pick favorites, but he sends me the most awesome one-page update of his operation every year. This includes his updated goals over the next year, 5, 10, 15 years. And it just allows me as a lender to make sure that we're still on track and being able to meet his goals and objectives going forward. And we're not surprised by the fact, oh, he found a tractor in the middle of the summer that was an awesome deal and he had to go.
so just a cool idea to be able to have out there.
And I'm not going to get into all of the rest of this. These are will be in the stuff that you can download, but in the interest of time, this was just some ideas of some different goals that you can be thinking about and be able to give you a little bit more information to go off of. So on that very fast whirlwind, just in summary, ask for help if you need it. There are lots of people out there that would love to help you get started with your bookkeeping operation.
Some basic questions about what presented tonight.
To shoot me an email. I'm definitely willing to help point you in the right direction if you need help on something, and trying to put that system together and trying to get organized. This is a hard time of year to pull everything together, but hopefully with cows are about out on pasture, take a day and get stuff set up before it's December 31st. And we're all stressing about these books that aren't done yet. So looks like we have another question on there.
That's actually just a thank you from Caitlin, who says thank you so much. And we had another thank you from the Leaches as well, and from Scooter for the detail that you've put into everything and making some real life examples. But yeah, does anybody have questions this evening? We can take definitely a few minutes here if there's anything that's super specific or burning a hole that you want to ask of Lacy. Getting some thank yous. So yeah, we will get Lacy's email address from her. She's I wasn't going to give it out without your permission, Lacy, because well, you are a loan officer. You're not necessarily the loan officer for all 50 people that we had on this call tonight. So but you've opened it up, so we'll do that. But also, just I think with your own loan officer, they know what, the answers to these questions as well. And just you having that forethought to be able to ask those questions of your loan officer, I think speaks volumes to where you are as an operator versus just kind of going in dark and not really picking up on what you might not know. So
yes,
Lacy,
definitely.
you got it in our email or in our chat here. So lacy.roberts@usda.gov.
Oh.
Great. Well, Lacy, thank you so much. I know I'm starting to get some things written down here to help myself, but that time management one, that's always huge for me, is just that hour on a Sunday morning or that half hour. I've started rewarding myself with a pop. I get to have my Coke on the nights that I do this. It's kind of my guilty pleasure coupled with the thing that I'm making myself do. We do have one question here from Tabitha, saying, I'm a private contractor and I'm trying to figure out what expenses to list under the boarding contract. And with get this blown up here so I can read it better. Trying to figure out what expenses to list under the boarding contract and with the main expenses budget. Should I just keep documenting receipts and try to keep everything under one umbrella?
I would definitely recommend that you try and get it separated out between your enterprises as much as possible. I don't know if you're talking like boarding horses or something like that, where that is potentially going to be like on a Schedule C as opposed to a Schedule F. So that's one you're going to want to visit with your accountant and see exactly what categories or what schedule you should be working off of. But that's something to definitely keep in mind there. As much as you can separate that out, then you can really analyze what your profit is between each operation.
Okay, perfect. And somebody just asked for a copy of the workbook, so I dropped that in the, I'll drop that in the chat here too. To everyone in the meeting, and we'll be sending out emails when this gets uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and we'll include this PowerPoint as well as Lacy's contact information. The general contact information for the FSA is at the end of your workbook as well. So thank everybody for joining this evening. We would love for you to join us the next couple of Mondays as we talk accountants and attorneys with Montana Roots Accounting and Keith Tokerud next week, and then we'll kind of bring it all together. We'll do a full picture with John Haskell at the end. And you know, Lacy and I didn't play off of each other too much when we were putting this together, and I have homework for you, which is exactly what Lacy was saying. Get some of this stuff done and put it down on paper. And so you'll notice that there is a weekly goals section in your workbook, and it's just labeled out by day, super simple planner, and you can already cross Monday off your list because you attended this webinar. So you've already put a little bit of work in, but I think if you can write down a few goals that you might have for coming out of Lacy's discussion, you can go ahead and put those down and try to hold yourself to them this week so that when we meet again next Monday, you're in a little bit better position. So once we are done with the 3 weeks of webinars, I will mail out a review so that you can all let us know how we did with this. We'd love your feedback, good or bad. So that's coming at the end of 3 weeks. If there's something you'd love for us to know, make sure you jot that down so you don't forget it at that time. And as I said, Lacy is an FSA loan officer. She's been kind enough to share her evening with us, as well as sharing her email address. But if you do have questions, you know, ask yours as well. There's a lot of different folks out there that are ready and willing to help you. And we don't have to put it all on Miss Lacy, although she's been very, very available for us in that. So thank you everybody for attending. We hope to see you next week, same place, same time, and I'll send you a reminder on Friday. Thanks everyone.